afternoon, everybody, our Artificial Hearts family. We have a very special guest all the way across the pond from Scotland. We have Professor George Pattison of the University of Glasgow with us, a Dostoevsky scholar. And it's a privilege to have you with us, Professor Pattison. And we want to thank you again for helping us with this project to disseminate the works of Dostoevsky to a young and a young adult audience. And we're really excited to have you on our platform today.
Well, it's great to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Perfect. Professor Pattison, can you maybe just introduce yourself to and tell us maybe a little bit more of what you're doing now and your areas of study to our internet followers, to our YouTube followers that are going to be watching this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the main areas of my academic study over the years have been the existentialist tradition, you could say Hegel and his critics, which includes Kierkegaard, perhaps the person I've written most on, but also Dostoevsky, Heidegger, and a number of other 20th century people. But Dostoevsky's been a very long-term part of that. And of course, he was inspirational for many of the existentialists. Jean-Paul Sartre quotes him in his lecture on what is existentialism, and he got taken up at that moment. Of course, today, perhaps we read him very differently. And that's, I suppose, one of the interesting things about Dostoevsky is the different ways in which he's been read in different periods since his death.
And speaking on these different ways that Dostoevsky has been read, tell us a little bit about, I'm curious to know, how did you first encounter Dostoevsky? What was one of your first books? And specifically to adapt to purposes of our podcast, what was your first encounter with the Brothers Karamazov like, if you remember?
Yeah, I didn't start reading Dostoevsky till I was in my 20s, actually. I think I'd read some Tolstoy and some Chekhov and some of the other Russian writers when I was at school. But I didn't get on to Dostoevsky till in my early 20s. Actually, I think at a time when I was working as a nursing assistant in a psychiatric hospital. So,
that makes
which
sense.
was possibly a very appropriate context
Very appropriate.
in which to begin reading Dostoevsky in Edinburgh. And if any of your listeners have ever visited Edinburgh or Glasgow, you'll know that these Scottish cities have something about them that's a little bit like Dostoevsky's St. Petersburg.
Wow.
You
Is it
literally have
spooky?
these. It can be very spooky. These ancient tenement buildings where all sorts of dark deeds have been done, and poets have starved in garrets for many centuries. So there is something I've always felt very Dostoevskian about these cities as well.
And before you continue, just out of curiosity, is Robert Louis Stevenson from Scotland?
That's right. He's from Edinburgh as well. So Dr. Jekyll and
Mr.
Hyde.
Hyde. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly. So.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, but sorry, please continue. Yeah. So so you're at a psychiatric ward, and how was kind of your first experience reading Dostoevsky like, and how did that kind of shape your scholarship?
Yes, I was reading him. I was reading him at that point just as an amateur reader, not as part of any scientific project or anything like that. Simply as someone reading a great novelist from the past. And I suppose I was blown away. I think I read my way through at least the major novels in translation, obviously, fairly quickly. And I suppose particularly in that context that I've mentioned, what one experienced day by day in the psychiatric hospital was the multiple levels at which human beings live, and how someone presents themselves socially is one thing, and what's really going on underneath may be something completely different, and one has to be prepared for the bizarre and the unexpected, conversations taking strange twists, and people turning out not what you thought them to be. It was at the same time, I should emphasize that I'd just come back to Christianity after a period in the 1960s when I'd been engaged in sort of radical 1960s things. So Dostoevsky also spoke very much to that, but in the sense that I think Dostoevsky's Christianity, who isn't just about being good, keeping the rules, going to church on Sunday, as it were, and the outward observances, but it's about dealing with all the tempests, if you like, that are going on inside the self, the emotions and the feelings, and working Christianity out as something that has to do with the whole self and not just theoretical beliefs. But I'm probably jumping ahead of some of the questions you want to ask.
This is exactly how this is supposed to be, how the format of our podcast works. And I was really curious and interested in you mentioning, do you want to maybe share or just give some context, not necessarily about what you were doing, but how the 60s were like, how that generation was like, and how did Dostoevsky maybe speak to some of those issues? Specifically, maybe if you want to comment on maybe a book or two that you read that maybe really had a strong impression on you.
Yeah, the 60s were very paradoxical. I mean, at one and the same time, I and a lot of my friends at university, you might go on a political demonstration, and we're all very engaged with the political thing. The Vietnam War was a big issue at that time, of course. And then again, you might then go off and read Suzuki on Zen Buddhism and imagine you were a Zen monk. So, I mean, completely paradoxical, and in some ways theoretically mutually exclusive things, political activism and Buddhist practice.
Were the
But
Beatles big?
it was all muddled up together, really. I think lots of things were starting up, and it was all very coherent and chaotic. But I think there's an interesting segue to Dostoevsky in that, the 1960s in Europe and America, I mean, in some ways was very similar to the 1860s and the 1870s in Dostoevsky as well, because the 1860s for the young generation in Dostoevsky's time were very much taken with new ideas of atheism, nihilism, protests against convention. Young women started cutting their hair short, wearing glasses and smoking cigarettes, which were all seen as very radical. Some of the popular books of the time suggested that people should go and live in communes, marriage should be abolished, religion should be abolished, social authority should be abolished. So many of these ideas that were churning around in Dostoevsky's time, as it were, came back again, I think, in the 1960s. And so there was some kind of natural affinity, I think, for that. Though, as I say, I didn't actually start reading Dostoevsky till the early 1970s, when I was kind of coming back towards Christianity. But I mean, that was also a thing for Dostoevsky, was how could this generation who'd experienced this, be brought back to Christianity without simply, he didn't want to just, as it were, crush all the creativity and all the ideas, though he opposed some of the ideas very vehemently, but to try to win people's trust and to speak to them as they were.
Well, that's fantastic.
And some of that's quite funny, because when he hired a secretary, the young woman who became his wife, Anna Snitkina, he offered each of the interviewees a cigarette to see if they'd take it. And if they took it, they didn't get the job, because that would be a sign that they had nihilistic beliefs.
Really? Wow, that's interesting.
So
Is
he was
that he had like difficulty?
Himself.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I mean, just a little information. I don't know if it's true, but I heard a story that he had like a very hard time finding a woman that was kind of compatible to his kind of like political or philosophical thinking, at least in his like circle of society. Is that true?
Yes, he had several very, after his first wife died, he had several very unfortunate relationships with women. Apollinaria Suslova was a radical student with whom he fell madly in love and chased her all over Europe, actually, to France and to Italy.
Wow.
He was madly in love with her. And then other women he came across, very often much younger women. One of the interesting things is that despite his quite conservative views, many of the young women he was attracted to were actually very active in, the women's question, as
The
it
more
was called
progressive
at
movements.
the time, exactly. And
Uh-huh.
he did think, he was very keen that women should have access to higher education, which was an issue at the time. At one point, women were admitted to higher education in Russia, but then it was shut down again. He thought women should have education, should be able to work for themselves and manage themselves in their own lives. And he admired some of the women he knew who qualified as doctors or mathematicians and had professional careers. And I think he thought that's how it should be. Indeed, Anna Snitkina, his wife, that a young woman had trained as a stenographer and had, as it were, a professional capacity. This was something still quite new in Russia. And although some of his ideas, as I say, about women were slightly strange, nevertheless, he definitely affirmed that women should make their own way. And of course, very crucial, comes into several of the novels, that women should have the right to choose whom they want to marry, and that they should marry for love and not because of family politics, class, or money, or all the other pressures that were on women at that time.
That's great. I mean, that's very interesting to maybe, I think that sheds a lot of light and maybe breaks a little some of like the preconceptions that people maybe have of him as this very like super conservative or reactionary writer. And thinking about that, I really wanted to maybe ask you, if you were one of the maybe novels, and I don't know if this was maybe the novel that really spoke to you in this period of your life that you were going through that you mentioned, but I think the Brothers Karamazov, it really addresses a lot of these issues that are at the heart of at the soul of the human condition. And I really wanted to know from you, because I know you've written about this, you've talked about this. If you were to explain like to maybe a lay audience, or maybe uh or maybe to your younger self, to George Pattison in the 70s,
Yes.
what the message of the Brothers Karamazov is, what is for you the sort of the heart or the main message of this book, of this classic?
Yes, I think it's not so much a message as a question, or if you like, the staging of a drama, even, that in the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky shows us several different ways of living. I also think it's very important that the narrator of the Brothers Karamazov talks about Alyosha as my hero. But Alyosha is only one of the brothers, and the novel that Dostoevsky wrote is called The Brothers Karamazov. And what's very important is the interplay between them. A number of years ago in St. Petersburg, I saw a ballet version of the Brothers Karamazov, actually. But there's a scene where they're all tied together with a string and dancing around the stage. So they can't escape from each other, and they're all colliding with each other in different ways, as one do with a dance. And I think that very well caught what's going on in the novel. So there's a number of different views of life, number of different personality types, if you like, represented, who are sometimes helping each other, sometimes in deep conflict. And most importantly, perhaps, he stages the dialogue between atheism, which is supremely represented by Ivan Karamazov, who has all the intellectual arguments against the existence of God, and the elder Zosima, the saintly monk, who doesn't give an intellectual answer to Ivan. And I think at one level, Dostoevsky perhaps thought, that there was no intellectual answer to be given at the level of the intellect. The question of faith will always be in doubt, that there will always be a counter argument, and maybe, even maybe the devil has all the good arguments. But what Zosima represents is not an argument, but a life that is wholly committed to selfless love, but also very practical love of others, who is accepting of even the lowest of the low, even the baddest of the bad, you could say, and who does not judge. And it's his lifestyle, if you like, his worldview, rather than just an argument, that Dostoevsky sets against Ivan. And in a sense, it's left to the reader to decide. And I mean, many people have read the Brothers Karamazov and concluded that actually Ivan has the best of it. He's the more persuasive character. Dostoevsky doesn't make the decisions for you. He shows you what's at issue, and then you, the reader, have to make up your own mind. And that's part of the great power, I think, of his writing. Whereas, let's say, a novel like Tolstoy's Resurrection, he tells you just what he thinks about how society should be and what should happen and how people ought to behave. Dostoevsky doesn't do that. He accepts the whole chaotic mess, as it were, of human life, and says, here are some possibilities. You could live like this, or you could live like that. What do you want? And importantly, at the end of the novel, well, it isn't really the end, because we just don't know what's going to happen to any of the brothers. We don't know whether Dmitri, who's been sent to prison wrongly for the murder of his father, whether he will decide to escape and flee to America, whether he will be broken by his penal servitude, or whether he will have some kind of resurrection, which he might, but we don't yet know. We don't know whether Ivan will recover from his mental breakdown. We don't know what will happen to Alyosha, who has left the monastery and is going out into the world. We know that Dostoevsky spoke about a future continuation of the novel in which Alyosha became a radical nihilist and maybe even a terrorist before returning to faith, though I don't put much stress on that, because Dostoevsky was always changing his mind when he was writing his novels. And, I think, if he had had time to write that next novel, it would probably have been very different from anything he'd imagined beforehand, because that's how he was. So life is, we're in the middle of it. We don't get to see the end. The end is for Dostoevsky in heaven, but that's a whole other order of things. Who knows what's going to happen next? And we just have to go forward, as it were, with the best that we can. But it's up to us to decide how to do that.
What's your favorite scene in the book, just to maybe wrap up this section on the
Oh goodness, that's
or favorite, or maybe a memorable scene that maybe really struck you when you read it for the first time? That
I think when I read it for the first time, one of the passages, if you like, that most struck me was when Dmitri is arrested for the murder of his father, which he didn't commit, though he would possibly quite like to have murdered his father, but he didn't do it. He's arrested, he's humiliated, he's forced to strip, he's held, and he falls asleep, and he has this extraordinary dream in which he is in a devastated landscape, burnt out villages, and he sees women standing by the side of the road with their babies who don't have enough to eat, crying, the kind of things we're seeing every day on our televisions at the moment, in a way. But he sees this, and he's moved by a deep compassion for the little baby. And this is so powerful, because up till then, we've seen Dmitri as a kind of brawling, drunken, womanizing soldier who doesn't really have much of a moral compass. And we've had hints that he's got a sensitive inner life, but this takes it to a whole new level. And after that dream, he is in many ways a changed person, and he is going to accept his humiliation. He's going to accept that life isn't just about doing what he wants whenever he wants it and following his own passions and his emotions anymore, that there's a bigger picture, there's a larger humanity at stake.
Wow, that's impressive. One of, at least for me, when I first read it, I think everybody always answers the Grand Inquisitor as their like scene. Yeah. For me though, I still think for me, kind of one of the most powerful ones, at least when I read it, was when Ivan meets the devil.
Yes.
And then Smirdiakov's confession to Ivan, and then Ivan meets the devil. For me, those are like some of like the deepest ones, in addition to like the Grand Inquisitor. But before we move on to our next section, Artificial Hearts podcast is brought to you by Artificial Hearts LLC, an anime sci-fi readaptation of Dostoevsky's classic, The Brothers Karamazov. So we have
yes,
Ivan, Alyosha, and which hopefully will be out soon for our
brilliant.
For our followers. And you can purchase your merchandise now at our Artificial Hearts YouTube website, and we are on all platforms: Instagram, Rumble, YouTube, and Facebook, and TikTok.
I'll check that out.
Absolutely, yeah, and we'll definitely. I'll try to, as soon as we. My co-host Kezia, she said hi. She says hi to everyone. She's in Brazil now, getting some new merchandise, which I will make sure to send you, Professor Pattison, as a token of our gratitude and appreciation for you being
here. I think this is one of the great things about Dostoevsky, actually, that I mean, there are some very good film adaptations that place it in the 19th century historical context. But so many of his works can be recontextualized in the contemporary world, in the contemporary imagination as well, which has happened again and again, I think, so that the great film director Robert Bresson took the story A Gentle Spirit and updated it to 1960s Paris.
Wow. What book was that one that he readapted? Sorry.
A Gentle Spirit.
Oh, A Gentle Spirit. Okay.
It's a short story about a pawnbroker who has basically, his wife has committed suicide after extensive psychological abuse, and he's standing by her dead body, waiting for the undertakers to come and take her away for burial. And he tells their story. The whole thing is a monologue.
Wow.
And he kind of understands that basically it's all down to him, but he doesn't really accept the responsibility for it. And so he ends with despair, really, in a very powerfully expressed despair that for me is as powerful as Ivan Karamazov's rebellion.
Oh, wow.
In a way. And the film is a more or less straight adaptation of it, but as I say, it resets it into 1960s Paris. And I think, with many of Dostoevsky's stories and scenes, you can do that. Of course, one of the most famous examples is the movie Taxi Driver. That
with Robert De Niro?
Yes, that many people think was inspired by Crime and Punishment, the idea of the person who takes it into his own hands to mete out justice, as it were, outside the law.
Oh, to become this kind of Superman. That's interesting.
No.
Wow, no, I liked it more now. That's what you said that. Well, Professor Pattison, you also have a book that is coming out, and we want to talk and hear more about it. It's called Conversations with Dostoevsky. I got my digital copy courtesy of you, but you who are watching us can pre-order yours now if you're in the US, and I think in the UK it's already out, so you can order it on Amazon.com. I want to say it's a really great book. I really enjoyed it, and I was hoping that maybe you could share a little bit with our followers, the folks that are watching us. What motivated you to write this book? And I'm asking that because when I was reading it, I noticed that it felt different than normal kind of dry scholarly publications. Like I'm writing a dissertation right now. It felt very personal, right? And
Yeah.
meaningful to you. So what was kind of the motivation behind this book, even though it's published by Oxford University Press? And who is the intended audience? And why did you choose to write this book as Conversations with Dostoevsky?
A lot of questions. Just to kind of make things entirely clear for your viewers, the book is in a way a work of fiction. The main character, the narrator, is a middle-aged academic teaching at Glasgow University. He's having a bit of a midlife crisis. His career isn't going anywhere in a hurry, and he's kind of wondering what it's all about. He's taken to sitting up late in his apartment, having a couple of glasses of whiskey. And the beginning of the book, he's reading Dostoevsky. In fact, he's reading this story, A Gentle Spirit, that I was just speaking about. And he feels that the despair of the pawnbroker, in a way, expresses the despair he's also feeling about his life. And then Dostoevsky appears in the seat opposite him, and they begin a series of conversations. I should emphasize that the narrator isn't me. He's different from me in a
Sorry,
number
for
of
some
ways.
reason I thought it was you. That's good.
You're not the first.
That's good though.
Yes, I mean, I've been a Christian priest since my 20s and have been a professional theologian, as it were, whereas our narrator, he teaches comparative literature. He had an evangelical upbringing, but he drifted away from faith when he was a teenager and student. And, you know, he's not hostile to it, but it doesn't really mean anything to him anymore. And so one of the questions he's asking Dostoevsky really is, how can I come to believe that love is possible in the world, that the world isn't just some kind of infernal machine? So, and they go through a number of issues. They have a series of meetings. One of the episodes is a dinner party where the people are all talking about Dostoevsky. And in fact, the narrator and Dostoevsky then meet in the kitchen afterwards, and Dostoevsky gives his response to what people have been saying. In another chapter is a seminar in Glasgow University, and Dostoevsky is quietly sitting at the back, and again, he gives his response to what's been saying. So it's not just a series of dialogues, there's a series of situations as well, and there's a slight plot development. So it is a work of fiction, and I think for me, writing it, it's a way, I mean, partly it just came to me, and to be honest. I'd just been to the conference of the International Dostoevsky Society in Boston in 2019.
Awesome.
And
awesome.
There's a wonderful collection of papers given there, and some of the top Dostoevsky scholars from around the world. And I did realize, you know, I come to Dostoevsky from a philosophical and theological background. I'm not deeply rooted in Russian studies or Slavic literature. Many of the people at that conference were, you know, they read all the things that Dostoevsky read, and they knew all the sources he knew, and the whole kind of history of critical debates from a literary and historical point of view. And I realized, you know, I was never going to write that sort of book, and I couldn't, and that actually it wouldn't be the best thing I could do. And on the plane back, I just had this flash, you know, of Dostoevsky. The opening line of the novel, Dostoevsky smiled diffidently, and I thought, yes, that's what I'm going to do. And I put it out first as a blog, putting out an episode once a week, starting at the beginning of 2020, and which was also a challenge because I was only ever, well, once or twice I was only ever 2 or 3 episodes ahead. You know, as you probably know, Dostoevsky, like many 19th century novelists, he also wrote serially, and he would send an episode off to the publishers, and then he would have a deadline for the next one. So it wasn't as if, like writing a PhD, he could write the whole thing and then revise it and so on. He had to do it. I did have the luxury of revising it after the blog, but that was an interesting challenge, and also getting feedback from people. And I think that's, you know, one of the things that's happened, I think, in our time, is that sort of gap has opened up between, on the one hand, academic specialization with this kind of really fine tuning, as it were, of specialist knowledge, whether it's about Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard or the Greeks or the economy of France in the Middle Ages. I mean, whatever it is, globally, this sort of massively finely tuned scholarly work on the one hand, and the kind of extreme popularity of, well, you know, X and all the rest of it, and social media, that, you know, you can only have however many 100 words, and everything's kind of very rapid. And the form of conversations is sort of in between them, because it goes back and forth. It takes time. It explores. It leaves questions unanswered. It changes direction, goes off at a tangent in a way you can't do in an academic work, but of course happens all the time in real life human conversations, and happens all the time in Dostoevsky's novels as well. So it seemed to me to be a good way of perhaps putting something out there that would help people who are already Dostoevsky readers to look at it in a new way, help some people at least to see, if they didn't read Dostoevsky or hadn't read much, why it might be interesting to do so, and also to focus, I think, on the reader and what we're doing when we read Dostoevsky, because, as I mentioned before, you know, Dostoevsky's been read many different ways. When people like Albert Camus read Dostoevsky, they saw someone who basically, they saw Ivan's rebellion, the protest against God in the name of suffering humanity. Other people have read Dostoevsky and seen the voice of
Alyosha,
Russian Orthodoxy.
right? Yeah.
You know, so people have different, and I think we need to be conscious about what we're looking for in Dostoevsky or any other great text of the past, because that's also going to shape what we will get out of it in the end.
Do you imagine this getting readapted into maybe like a stage play or a movie in the future?
Well, I didn't when I was writing it, but I kind of subsequently thought that, you know, maybe it could. I mean, that's not for me to do. I mean, I like that format too. I did some years ago adapt one of Kierkegaard's books for stage play, which we put on a couple of times. Repetition.
Oh, cool.
And there were some actors interested in doing a more professional job with it, but as always in these things, funding doesn't always show up.
That's what we're finding out. But anyway, Professor Pattison, in the preface to the book, in conversation with Dostoevsky, you mentioned, and I paraphrase, so yeah, please correct me if there's anything wrong, but I guess the main idea, at one point in the preface, you mentioned that Dostoevsky's theology and his religion cannot be separated from the totality of his writings, fictional or non-fictional. So in light of that, what role does religion, and particularly Christianity and or Christian theology, play specifically in the Brothers Karamazov, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, that's right. And I think that's, you know, as we were saying before, you know, there's a certain sort of intellectual approach to Christianity, and a lot of modern Christian writing, what's called apologetics, is on this kind of intellectual level, designed to present arguments that are more persuasive than the arguments of the atheists as to the existence of God or immortality, or whatever. Dostoevsky doesn't deny that metaphysical intellectual level, and I think it's in the background, but he also understands that human beings operate on different levels. They operate as psychological beings, and how we are emotionally in our relations with the people we love and the people we hate, or also shapes who we are, and also social beings. And this is where his, if you like, politics comes in, because for Dostoevsky, being human for him is inseparable from being Russian. And the whole his ideas about Russia, some of which come out in the novels, a lot of which come out in his journalistic writings about contemporary politics, are very important. So for him, I think religion operates at all of these levels, at the metaphysical, at the psychological, but also at the social. There's Nicholas Berdyaev, who's one of the important commentators of Dostoevsky in the 20th century, said somewhere about Russia that, you know, unlike in the Western world, unlike in the European Protestant world, where there's this great emphasis on morality, you know, Russia doesn't produce morally virtuous people, but it can produce saints. So that's a rather different thing. So
Yeah.
there's the intellect, there's morality, the psychology, the social world, and for Dostoevsky, you know, Russia has a very distinctive take, if you like, on being human, though, you know, that's of course become hugely problematic in the last few years, not least as, you know, I don't like to say this, but in all honesty, one has to say it, that Vladimir Putin says that Dostoevsky is amongst his favorite reading, and he cites him in some of his speeches and some of Dostoevsky's criticism of the West. But I mean, that is a part of Dostoevsky, and we can't deny it. But I think a good part of that as well is, I remember talking to a woman who grew up in Mexico City some years ago, and she loved Dostoevsky, and she said he was the only European writer who wrote about the kind of people she knew in Mexico City. All the others were wrestling, if you like, with moral problems about how to be good, rather than the sort of experiences that she and her friends went through.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And I agree with your friend as well. I mean, I'm originally from Brazil, so there is a sort of like timelessness about Dostoevsky that he can kind of touch. Like his characters, right, are so human in a way that kind of transcends all these temporal, geographic, and cultural barriers. And I think that's kind of a great segue to the following question. And like I said, I loved how you were able in the book to. Dostoevsky is a very personal writer, and I think this is a very personal book that takes on that dimension. And I thought there was like a very wholesome scene where the character and his wife, they refer to each other like Grushninka and Dmitri. And that made me kind of curious about you as kind of the author, the writer. Who is your favorite character from the Brothers Karamazov? And if so, why? That I was really curious about that when I was reading it.
Yeah, I think, well, you know, I'm pretty old now, and it's probably getting on, it's about 50 years since I first read Dostoevsky. So, you know, these things change over time. I think, as I said before, when I first read it, and your questions about what scene stuck when I first read, probably I felt a lot closer to Dmitri in a way. I mean, I hadn't been a soldier, but you know, I was a young man, and I was fairly stroppy and kind of all over the place. But so I felt a lot of resonance with Dmitri. And it's interesting, in, you know, many film and stage adaptations, it's nearly always Dmitri who's the main character.
Because he's like the big guy.
Yeah, he's the one that's most easy to relate to, for, at least for a lot of young men. But I could also see elements of Ivan in myself, of course. I wouldn't say I've ever identified with Alyosha, but I kind of like his project, as it were, of bringing the boys together as he does, and, you know, creating this new community at the end of the novel. I think, I mean, maybe it's just a thing of getting older, or in this case of just having been reading the novel many times, teaching it as well. It's not so much the individual characters I identify with as the interplay between them, like I said about the ballet. One realizes that, you know, there are many aspects of of our own selves that are reflected in each of these. I don't know if this is showing in America, but one of the big things in Britain at the moment is a one-man performance of Uncle Vanya under the title Vanya, where this
Oh.
one, it was staged in the National Theatre and filmed, and has been showing in cinemas of the staging. And it's brilliant because it shows you how all these different personalities, for all their differences, nevertheless come in and out, as it were, of the same person, which, and of course, in real life, they all came out of Chekhov, in a sense, even if maybe they were based on people he knew, he created them all as stage characters. So I think, we, as Dmitri himself said, that, the human being, at least the kind of man he is stretched between Sodom at one level and the Madonna at the other, and he seeks both Sodom and he seeks the Madonna.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a bit too old for that, but
Yeah.
that we are each of us torn different ways between multiple aspects, and it's the struggle with those and between those. I think that Dostoevsky gets, and that is so inspiring, basically, in how he writes.
Right, and maybe just riffing a little bit on your point, right? I think maybe that's what that kind of explains that famous citation, right? That there is an angel and a demon inside each one of us that are fighting, right? There's this sort of inner conflict. And I guess that's also one of the things that I really love about kind of his works, is this ability to really trace all these dimensions, like you mentioned, of the human personality, right? Like even in Alyosha, there is an angel and a demon that are fighting inside Alyosha. Alyosha uses that citation where he's that famous quote that you're on the upper floor, I'm on the lower floor, but if you're on the lower floor, you eventually get to the upper floor. So we all suffer from this sort of broken human condition that affects us all. But if anything preserves society even in our time and transforms and regenerates the criminal, it is only the law of Christ, right? So there's this sort of ethical dimension that is outside of merely like the human being, that I personally, speaking for myself, really find it beautiful. But
I think, as you say, that one of the things that particularly struck Dostoevsky when he was a prisoner, when he was a convict, that the local people in Siberia referred to the convicts as the unfortunates. And he felt this was a very typically Russian thing, that they didn't sit in moral judgment on them, but they just regarded them as unfortunate because they each realized that, if such and such had happened in their lives, maybe they'd be the ones going to prison for a long time, that none of us are so good that we can't fall. And I think that's a very valuable lesson to take, because I think in our society today, we have become very judgmental.
yes.
And straight, we go on about Victorian judgmentalism, but actually I think we're very judgmental now, and we divide the world into good guys and bad guys. And, if someone's committed a crime and three strikes and you're out there,
And you're out.
they're a criminal for life. Whereas Dostoevsky, of course, he had first-hand experience of living with the worst of the worst.
Right.
Because Dostoevsky didn't have Russia didn't have the death penalty at that time, so he was living in barracks with people who'd done absolutely unbelievable things, and yet he could see that even in those men that there was some spark, as it were, something good that can be found. So we're not just good guys or bad guys. Each of us is both. And Zosima says that the judge, when he has the criminal in front of him, the judge, should think that he's even more guilty than the criminal, which seems an odd saying, and people think it's very peculiar, of course. In the novel, they think, how can you say that? But I think there's a kind of logic to it, because each of us is involved in the structures of society that make it so that some people, fall off the ladder, as it were, because society is the way it is. People are tempted to crime, and sometimes, of course, if people are in very vulnerable social situations, it's very easy to understand why they might slip. And, unfortunates, not bad guys. course, this is a big theme in the literature of Dostoevsky's time as well. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, of
Yes.
course, Jean
Great,
Valjean,
other fantastic work. Yeah.
which Dostoevsky greatly admired.
Really?
And
Wow.
yes, he rated it, I think, as the greatest novel of the 19th century thus
Wow.
far. At one point, he said that. Um,
Wow.
but for him, Jean Valjean, he's the poor man who steals a loaf of bread to feed his family, gets sent off to prison for however many years, and all the brutality that follows from that.
And,
So this was a repeated theme in Dostoevsky, in his personal experience, but also I think, as I say, in literature in general, in Victor Hugo, in Dickens, many of the great 19th century writers.
and not to interrupt you, but even the theodicy element, right? Like the whole question of justice, like Javert and Ivan, seems like
Yes,
kind of similar types of personalities of sort of characters, like law, like they all deal with like the law, this sort of legalistic understanding, cruel
that's
view
right.
of the law.
And Hugo has at the beginning this Bishop Bienvenu, many people have seen as a kind of prototype of Dostoevsky's Zosima. Of course,
Oh,
Zosima is very kind of Russian, if you like,
mhm,
but he's obviously got the same all forgiving, all accepting kind of love towards the unfortunate person in
mhm.
front of him.
Wow, and that's a great, I think, segue to kind of our next question. Like we see Christianity is very much something that's kind of embedded in the worldview, in the well, in Dostoevsky's own life story, right? We know the famous story that he was about to die, to be executed, and he's sentenced is commuted to imprisonment in Siberia, and he receives a Bible. And there was a really interesting part in conversation with Dostoevsky, and like I promised, I'm not gonna spoil it, but you can get your copy because this is a great book on Amazon. But there's this on page 51, uh, you have this sort of dialogue of the main character with Dostoevsky, where Dostoevsky discusses the importance of the Bible. And I was wondering if you could just maybe elaborate a little on why the Bible was so important for Dostoevsky, and particularly important for the creation of his, like the characters that we see in the stories.
Yeah. As you say, Dostoevsky was given a Bible, a New Testament, in fact, on his way to prison in Siberia. And that was, in fact, the only book he was allowed to read in prison. So for the next 4 years, his only reading was this copy of the New Testament. He also wasn't allowed to write, so he didn't have pencil and paper, but he did make markings in it with his fingernails and other things. I've not actually seen this myself because when I went to the Dostoevsky Museum where it's kept, it was away for restoration, but it actually exists and can be seen, a very sort of tatty New Testament with lots of scratchings in it.
The original
So
Bible, sorry, the original New Testament.
yes, the
Oh,
one that he had, yes, he kept it with him throughout his life. I think he had it with him on his deathbed. So it was of huge significance for him, and especially the Gospel of John. But in fact, he did, thanks to the prison doctor, smuggled in a couple of novels of Charles Dickens that he was able to read. But so the only things he read in prison were the New Testament and Charles Dickens. And anyway, of course, he was already familiar with the Bible, largely, as he says, from a collection of children's stories by a German writer called Johann Huber, which is, in fact, still in print. And, you mentioned Amazon before. I mean, you can go and buy it on Amazon or any other online retailer in English translation now. I mean, it's hugely successful 19th century children's Bible, probably a little bit old-fashioned for us now. But so he was familiar with all the Old Testament stories. I think obviously Job, suffering Job, who, despite being, as it were, a good man, not doing any wrong, uh, his children are killed, his wealth is destroyed, his wife curses him, he's sick, and he's left alone to protest at the injustice of God. That clearly made a very powerful impact on Dostoevsky and resonates many times, I think, in his work. But in the New Testament, especially the Gospel of John, but one can see all sorts of ways in which some of these stories inform the novels. Obviously, in a way, the whole scenario of Raskolnikov is a kind of version of the prodigal son, the person who goes off and does bad, but is brought back to the good. This sort of conversion story, which is at the center of so many New Testament narratives.
Or Lazarus, right? The
Yeah,
resurrection.
and of course, as you say, in the middle of Crime and Punishment, Sonia, the good-hearted prostitute, reads the raising of Lazarus to Raskolnikov, and that kind of prefigures his own resurrection from the moral death into which he has fallen, that he has been killing himself as well as killing the old women. Of course, that's something that you hear this testimony from a number of people in the armed services who, when they've had to kill, they say they've killed something in themselves as well. And this is especially sharp for Raskolnikov, who's committed this brutal murder. And Sonia sees that he is killing himself, not just other people. So that's a very, very powerful scene. In The Possessed, it takes its motto from the story of Christ casting the demons out into the swine, who all rush off and drown themselves in the lake. Kind of rather strange story, but nevertheless a powerful one. In The Brothers Karamazov, well, there are multiple references to the Bible. Another scene that has, as it were, grown on me particularly over the years is this scene where the elder Zosima has died. Alyosha is sitting by his coffin, waiting for the funeral. He's in despair at the death of the elder, but he falls asleep and he has a dream, which is actually a reenactment of the wedding at Cana, Galilee, where Christ turns water into wine, and he sees Zosima there in the midst of the wedding guests. And that dream occasions him to rush out into the garden and has, I suppose you could say, some kind of mystical experience. I mean, another important biblical theme running through the Brothers Karamazov is a quotation: "Am I my brother's keeper?" And that we are called not to be each other's murderers, but to be each other's keepers and to watch out for each other. And that's, again, I think, a crucial phrase running through that novel. So that, the Bible is all over the place in many respects. In Dostoevsky, he knew it deeply, thoroughly, and quotes from a wide range. But
wow, that's amazing. And I think you pointed to something so interesting, which is maybe the theme of suffering. We see suffering, I mean, throughout almost all of the five major books, right? And in Conversations with Dostoiévski, it says, and I quote, "Suffering was an unavoidable part of the human condition, but it was something that had to be rescued from through love." That's page 67 of Conversations with Dostoiévski. How do you see this idea that you wrote here about suffering and as an unavoidable part of the human condition that has to be rescued by love? How do we see it being played out in the protagonists that you very nicely showed us are colliding with one another?
Yeah, I think one of the myths about Dostoevsky, if you like, is that Dostoevsky was obsessed with suffering, and he, as it were, plunged his hands had got some kind of pleasure out of plunging his hands into all the dirt of life. I think that's untrue. But he did recognize that dirt, as it were. So, and he writes in a way that's very unusual in the 19th century, quite explicitly, about the sexual abuse of children. This is not because he thinks the sexual abuse of children is a good thing, but because he saw it happening. As he said, you could see child prostitutes on the street of London or St. Petersburg, but people just chose not to see, to use a biblical phrase. They walked by on the other side and everyone pretended it wasn't happening, as indeed you could say they do today. But so he turned the spotlight and said, "Look, this is happening in the midst of our society. This needs to change." But I think he did think that suffering was inevitable because each of us human beings, because of how we are, we have a natural, if you like, egoistic desire to survive. We want to survive and flourish. We want our own interests to prevail. But then, of course, when you bring two people together, their interests never exactly coincide. And one will try to win the other round, and if they can't do that, then they'll use a bit more pressure, and if that bit more pressure doesn't work, then they will apply even more. So again, like the story of the pawnbroker and his wife, which is a kind of classic story of psychological abuse within marriage. And I think Dostoevsky learned a lot of this from his first marriage, because although his second marriage was very happy and fulfilling for both of them, his first marriage, they were basically utterly incompatible, and went a long way towards making life hell for each other, because at each stage, each of them wanted opposite and different things, and yet there they were, married and having to live together, and tormenting each other. And of course, for existentialism, at least for Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, Sartre believed that that's, if you like, how all our human relationships are, that human relationships are essentially antagonistic. He has this little example where I'm in the park and I see an empty bench. Maybe I don't really want to sit on it, but the moment I am aware of someone else being there and the possibility that they might go and sit on it, there's a kind of competition. Whose bench is it? Am I going to get to sit on it? Sorry?
Like a mimetic desire, like you liked it because you saw somebody else doing it.
Exactly, and it's true. When I used to run a lot, I'd be running along, and then you'd sort of hear someone running behind you, and maybe they'd be getting closer, and that would make you kind of speed up a little bit because you wouldn't want to be overtaken. And I mean that's kind of how we are. But for Sartre, that's the kind of end of it, really, is that all human relationships are ultimately violent, no matter how polite or how well ordered. We're always essentially hostile towards each other. Dostoevsky recognized that, if you like, as one possibility, but I think he also believed that we can work through that. Maybe in this life we can never overcome it entirely, but we can make progress. We can learn to put our own egotistical interests to one side for the sake of the other person, which of course he models in literary terms with Zosima and Alyosha, that Alyosha is always there to help his brothers, not to, as it were, push his own claim against theirs. Though even Alyosha is not perfect, and at one point, again with reference to being your brother's keeper, he realizes he's forgotten about Dmitri at a crucial point because he's so preoccupied with other things. So it's very difficult. It's a struggle, but I think he thinks we can make progress ultimately.
Well, that's awesome. Professor Pattison, we want to be mindful and respectful of your time. Would it be possible for us to just ask 2 more questions before we wrap up?
Sure, yeah.
Perfect, because I think these are very important to kind of conclude. I really found it interesting that I think at a point in the book, the protagonist kind of says something along the lines, I don't know if Dostoevsky had ever read Pascal, but he'd have understood Pascal's line that the heart has its reasons. I also wondered that a lot. I also wondered if Dostoevsky read Pascal and Augustine, because Augustine, you have like that famous quote, "Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." And Pascal also had another quote that was, at the heart of every human being, there's an infinite spiritual hole that can only be filled by an infinite spiritual object. which is Christ. And I really wanted to know maybe kind of your thoughts on that, on in your opinion, how does Dostoevsky understand and grapple with the problem of meaning and the human heart? I guess, in other words, how does he address the underlying issues, no pun intended, at the heart of this human condition?
Yeah, I think first of all, speaking as a scholar, that the jury is out as far as to whether he read Pascal or not is concerned. There are a couple of quotes from Pascal in the novels, but they're the sort of quotes that, I mean, lots of people who've never read Pascal know the line about the heart has its reasons, and a few other quotations. So, and they might know that it's by Pascal and they cite it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've read him. So I don't know whether Dostoevsky's knowledge of it was just that sort of general cultural knowledge, or whether he did read it. It's hard to say, but certainly I think that's absolutely right that he is, if you like, a master in portraying the reasons of the heart. That he's very aware of the head. I mean, he read Hegel, he read philosophy, he was interested in the intellectual challenges of his time, but it was really the human heart that interested him. And of course, that resonates also with the emphases of the kind of orthodox spirituality that you see in someone like the elder Zosima, where what it's about is the prayer of the heart, and that this is specifically at the center of spiritual practice in that monastic tradition. So this is absolutely, I think, what it's about. It has even been suggested that actually, Pascal notes that human beings have this sort of fleshly dimension, and then they have an intellectual dimension, and then they have, as it were, a spiritual dimension. And it has been suggested that maybe Dostoevsky applied that in the brothers Karamazov, with Dmitri being the flesh, Ivan being the intellect, and Alyosha being the spirit. But I think that idea could have come from elsewhere. It wouldn't have to have come from Pascal.
Yeah, sorry, just to riff a little bit on that, because I always wondered if the three weren't maybe inspired on kind of the trichotomy of the soul and the republic, like the irascible, the rational, and then I guess the spiritual, or the soul. Well,
that makes a lot of sense, except of course we have to complicate it a bit further, because we know, as we said before, that Dmitri is the flesh, but he also longs for the Madonna.
Yes.
And Alyosha is kind of spiritual goodness, but he's also tempted by Grushenka. And so each of them is sort of contradictory within.
Almost like a subversion of that in a way, right?
That's right. But again, that we're all internally complicated.
Wow. Yeah, I really like the quote that you have at the beginning of the book. I think it's from The Idiot, and I'm probably watching it, but the causes of human motivation are so much more deeper than what we've seen, right? And I wish that was something that some sectors, I think, of like our society would take more seriously, because I think a lot of maybe there's so much reductionist explanations of I think human behavior. So I really appreciate.
That's right, and people are always ready to ascribe bad motivations to a person, but there's a whole history behind each of our actions.
Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. And to wrap it up, well, thank you, Professor Pattison. Thank you for your time. I know we haven't met before, but it's a privilege to be meeting you and having this podcast, and we really appreciated you having you with us here on our platform. And if you're watching us, please make sure that you get his book, Conversations with Dostoevsky. I promise you, it will be a fun read. It's published by Oxford University Press, very prestigious, well-respected academic publisher, but it's not written. It's written as a work of fiction that I think will introduce any of you to the wonderful works of Dostoevsky. And again, this podcast was brought to you by Artificial Hearts, a graphic novel that is coming soon. And in the spirit of the Brothers Karamazov, faith does not in the realist spring from the miracle, but the miracle from faith. And I think that's a very good summary of a lot of the message of the characters from Dostoevsky. And to conclude, to give you the final word, Professor Pattison, I understand, right, that we have to be wary of not falling into the trap of presentism or committing anachronisms or projecting our own present day concerns into Dostoevsky's writings or to the writings of any character, historical figure from the past. But how do you think his writings still speak to some of the existential, and I'll let you choose what you want to speak on, but just to maybe, a lot of the sort of existential, social, political, and other questions that we're grappling with in the West currently. And then feel free to say whatever,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is about what we've just been talking about, in fact, that, we live in a time, and maybe, society has always been like this, to be honest, but, we're living through it today, that it's so tempting to pigeonhole people. We have the good guys, we have the bad guys, we have these very simplistic views of what makes people tick and what motivates them. And that, of course, is very superficial. And Dostoevsky, as it were, kind of pulls the curtain aside a bit and lets us see that we're much more complicated than that people have powerful internal conflicts that they bring into their relationships with others. So by the time you've got a room full of 3 people, you've already probably got about 9 different agendas going on. And, you can't cut that down to one single simple takeaway, as it were. So Dostoevsky invites us into this, as it were, deeper and larger view of what it is to be human. And I think that's a huge service. That one of the things that he says of Russia, and it may be equally true of other countries, I think, but that Russia is broad. And of course, it is geographically broad, has often been commented on. This is a theme, if you like, in Russian literature and philosophy as well, that it encompasses so much, such great extremes, and yet they all belong to it. And that's a kind of macrocosm in a way of how each of us is as well. So next time, any of us, I do it, we all do it, we can't help doing it, oh, this person is such and such, that person is such and such. Well, think twice, because there's certainly more than that. What we see socially is only ever the tip of the iceberg. There's a nice story where Dostoevsky describes a Christmas party in St. Petersburg, and a nice middle class home, and scores of people gathered around, and of course it's all going back to what we were saying about mimetic rivalry. All the girls have their best dresses on, the parents are all looking to see who's got the most expensive presents or the smartest suits. Superficially, it's actually not a very attractive picture, because you see people in social competition. Dostoevsky says, if only we could really put all that away and just see ourselves as we really are, then we would all rush together and embrace one another in love. That we're actually not only deeper than our social self, we're also better and kinder than we're socially conditioned to be. And I think that's great, really. If only we could.
And on that note, thank you. Thank you for being on our podcast. Thank you for watching us. It was a pleasure having you all with us. And we look forward to more in the future conversations with Dostoevsky.